et de eius semper constans unico Dei per Christum Dominum nostrum.
Amen.
Sede sapientiae.
Ora pro nobis.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Anyone missing today?
Greg, I think so.
All right, so we're on page 44, I believe. That's my last mark. Yes. Okay, so on page 44, in the left-hand column. See, okay, yes, we were just about to start. I think we touched upon at least a little bit the concession made by Pope Paschal II. So, preliminary treaty was concluded, remember, under pressure. We'll back up a little bit to the bottom of page 43, the bottom of the right-hand column on that page. For 2 months, Paschal II was subjected to the most fearful threats and cruel treatment by Henry V, the son of Henry IV, who himself caused so much trouble. His son is no better. Henry V was subjected to the most fearful threats and cruel treatment. Remember, after having, under cover of night, dragged the Pope with him as he fled Rome, dragged the Pope with him like a common felon, bound with cords, out of the city as he himself ran away. So, for 2 months, Paschal II was subjected to the most fearful threats and cruel treatment, but his unbending firmness remained unconquered, and he would not acknowledge the king's right of investiture. The bishops of Italy made a last appeal, representing to him the wretched state of the captives whom Henry's tyranny kept in chains, far from their home and from the objects of their tenderest affections. Also the desolation of the Roman Church, deprived of nearly all its cardinals, the danger of a schism, which would renew all the horrors of war. So, overcome by that, by their tears, with which he freely mingled his own, according to our author, the unhappy Pope essentially decided to give way. So you have words related here by our author. But in any case, a preliminary treaty was then concluded between the two parties on the 3rd of April of 1111 AD. The Pope signing the bull granting the right of investiture in, well, the terms that you see given there. So allowing the civil power to invest bishops and abbots with the crozier and ring, which is what this whole fight has been about, lay investiture of those symbols of ecclesiastical authority. So it's something that, considered an abuse, because that's something that it's impossible that the civil power could grant that. That's that he who has no jurisdiction in the church could ever grant jurisdiction in the church. That is to say, it is impossible. So it is possible that someone have jurisdiction at once, both in the state and in the church. That is possible. But here the question was of those who clearly have no jurisdiction in the church, still investing these symbols of ecclesiastical jurisdiction upon bishops and abbots. Yeah, that is an abuse, because it seems to say something that is false. It is, in some sense, a lie in action. It's possible to lie, of course, by any means, in multiple different ways, and one of those is by indicating something by means of actions, which is not true in reality. Now, of course, on the other side of that is the fact that you can tell, to a certain extent, what things are permissible in themselves, which things are moral and or at least can be morally permissible to do, based on what the church permits in practice, as well as what it teaches. So, things that the church allows, it means that something can be done, or that you can draw certain conclusions from it. I think we brought it up before. For example, the fact that it has happened in the history of the church, mainly in the Eastern rites, but even some Roman rite priests have been sometimes granted the faculties necessary to confer the sacrament of confirmation. And that is something that can be granted, apparently, because it actually has been granted by the authority of the church. So it's something that clearly you can draw the conclusion from that is a power that a simple priest has, because that's something that's granted. Again, it's just a faculty granted. does not involve any ceremony of episcopal consecration. So in the case of, yes, of an episcopal consecration, a bishop, he who is validly consecrated a bishop, can confirm someone who is already validly baptized, whether or not he is even allowed to be doing anything at all. He can do it validly. So it could be that the bishop is suspended or something and not allowed to confer any sacrament, but still presumes to confirm somebody. That's still valid. Gravely illicit, but still valid. Still works. Whereas in the case of a simple priest attempting to confirm without the necessary faculties is invalid. So clearly you can see that the church can grant that to a simple priest, the power to confirm. But also that the church can, to at least some extent, prevent by her very laws the attempted conferral of a sacrament from even being valid at all, because that is such an example. So, that's just one little example of what the church has permitted, indicating certain doctrinal things, certain doctrinal questions. And even, we could go more into that, but for now, just leave it at this. That there are actions can sometimes convey doctrines. They definitely indicate something about a doctrine. Sometimes it might, something that's permitted in practice might involve a clarification of some doctrine, but it's always in conformity with it. Definitely that. So it's, in some sense, it is always an act of teaching what the church allows, or does in practice, the ceremonies of the Mass, for example. As well, of course, as the prayer, as well as all the prayers contained in it. So after the signing of the treaty, the Pope proceeded to the solemn coronation of Henry V, and on the same day returned to Rome, where he was received with such a display of popular enthusiasm that it took him the whole day to reach his palace. But Paschal II did not enjoy this dear-bought freedom. He saw the dishonor which such an act must reflect upon his pontificate. So this isn't the only time in the history of the Church in which the Pope has allowed this. Pope Pius VII will later do a similar thing with Napoleon in the early 19th century. And we'll see, similar to what Paschal II did, would go back on it very shortly thereafter. Because that's a bad idea to allow that. We notice here, we have the asterisk and then a footnote. We need not here recall at length the principles laid down in the discussion on Pope Liberius. So Paschal II, a prisoner loaded with chains, yields to violence and signs the recognition of the investiture. The man failed by human weakness, perhaps, but there is nothing in this fact which can invalidate the dogmatic infallibility of the Pope freely teaching a truth of faith, ex cathedra. And this is something it doesn't really ever come up in today's controversies because it's pretty obvious that, as our author explains, that it clearly didn't involve any formal heresy. We'll see that. But also, he went back on it very quickly. So, we'll look at this. And Paschal II was not free, and every act extorted by violence, violence, in the words of Bossuet, is null and void. So yes, that is just a general principle. That's something due to an act carried out under with unjust fear, under the influence of fear unjustly inflicted, is generally speaking invalid. Even say, for example, a marriage contracted when one or the other of the parties is under unjust fear unjustly inflicted, that's automatically invalid by law of the church. Yeah, not every fear is unjust, but when the fear under which either one or the other of the parties, or perhaps both, is unjustly inflicted, that's an invalid marriage by the law of the church. There would be no need for an inmate in the case of a situation in the church in which there would be the authority, someone invested with the jurisdiction to grant an annulment. It wouldn't be necessary. Just be clear from documentary proof, invalid. Those parties are still free to marry. So that's just a general principle. And you see that even explicitly in the laws of the church with regard to marriage. But it is just a general principle that nothing cannot be considered fairly won or bought or acquired in any way from somebody who is under unjust fear. All right, so was the acknowledgement of the right of investiture a formal heresy? So our author clearly distinguishes, well, if that was meant to be a recognition of the supposed right of the spiritual authority, of granting spiritual authority by the temporal power, then that would be formal heresy. But that was not actually the case. It was just, as he explains, If it simply recognized the bestowal of the crozier and the ring, no further claim on the part of the king than that of because I really should be C-R, and going to the American spelling, C-R-O-Z-E-R. Crozier. Then of requiring the homage due from the bishops to their suzerain, so overlord, because remember, yes, we are in a time of union of church and state, and bishops were recognized as being feudal lords as well as being, of course, princes of the church. And so they did have a certain function in the state as well. But the crozier and ring are clearly the symbols. That's not, say, granting some other symbol by the king to indicate, okay, I also include you in the apparatus of the civil power of the government of the state. It's not as though he's sending him some kind of I don't know what symbol there might be, but sending him some symbol of a temporal jurisdiction. The crozier and ring clearly indicate ecclesiastical jurisdiction. The episcopal ring that's granted during the ceremony of episcopal consecration. The crozier that is also bestowed on the bishop-elect during the ceremony of episcopal consecration. Those are clearly symbols of ecclesiastical jurisdiction. Yes, they're granted even in the ceremony in which someone is being consecrated a bishop who may never actually hold jurisdiction, but the way that they clearly are ordered towards symbolizing ecclesiastical jurisdiction, clearly. And their power of orders and power of jurisdiction, let's never forget, are truly distinct. Those are two different things, but they are meant to go together. They're meant to be both invested in the same person. So they don't always, for whatever reason, they're not always simultaneously present in the same person for any number of possible reasons, but they are meant to go together. So you could have, for example, a bishop-elect of a diocese who's already is still in power of order as a simple priest, but who is already in power of jurisdiction a bishop before his episcopal consecration ceremony. So he's already the bishop of the diocese in terms of his jurisdiction. But obviously it's not fitting that someone have the jurisdiction of a bishop without having the power of orders of a bishop. He can't really do everything that he ought to do as the bishop of that diocese without having also the power of orders. So not being a bishop in power of orders, he can't ordain priests for his diocese, of course. But he should be able to do that and should be the one doing that. Therefore, he ought to be also a bishop in with regard to his power of orders. So it's definitely not fitting that that state of affairs should remain any longer than can be helped. But sometimes that has happened. There are instances of that in the history of the church. Yeah, and reasons why that might be the case. It could be a mission territory or a developing territory, maybe just got upgraded from just a mission territory to being a diocese, and needs a bishop right away to take care of it, but it'll take time to send another bishop to that same place to have that bishop-elect actually consecrated a bishop and made a bishop in terms of power of orders. So, yeah, definitely the crozier ring are meant to symbolize ecclesiastical jurisdiction. Even if they might be used by someone who doesn't actually have it, they are still meant to be. And that's clear from the way that pontifical ceremonies are described, because actually it's in the past, today we do everything by epikeia, but in the past, if a bishop were to be, for example, an auxiliary bishop, who is not the bishop of the diocese, were to celebrate a pontifical mass, he would have to have permission to use the crozier. Because the idea is that only the bishop who has ordinary jurisdiction over this diocese uses the crozier, which, of course, has the shape of a shepherd's crook, and is meant to be the symbol, therefore, of the jurisdiction over the faithful, by analogy, a flock over whom he rules and of which he takes care. That's what the crozier is meant to symbolize, the ecclesiastical jurisdiction. It's ordered to it. So an auxiliary bishop could have gotten permission to use it, but he had to have permission. Now today, of course, you see traditional Catholic bishops using the crozier. It's okay, at least in the principle of epikeia, because that definitely significantly enhances the ceremony. Everyone expects to see the bishop carrying around a crozier during a ceremony. But it really is ordered towards symbolizing ecclesiastical jurisdiction. And to allow the civil power to give that in a regular way would easily lead people to think, okay, maybe the civil power can grant ecclesiastical jurisdiction. That's why it's problematic. So, if the acknowledgement then of this Paschal II's granting this right was simply to acknowledge the homage due from bishops as members of the civil power, as members of the apparatus of the state, to their suzerain, to their overlord, for the domains they held as his vassals, then it's not a heresy. So it is evident that Paschal II signed the grant in the latter sense, and this twofold view of the question explains how the councils could condemn the investiture as heresy, while Ivo of Chartres and other bishops could with equal justice defend the contrary thesis. Right, so that Paschal II, by acknowledging this right, fell through a weakness which he afterwards bitterly deplored, but which did not, properly speaking, constitute a heresy. So that's the conclusion. And indeed. And in any case, he went back on it anyway. He decided it was actually a bad idea, and he rescinded that. Yeah, much as Pius VII did, 3 days after he granted a similar thing to Napoleon. So that's another story, but it's a problem that has come up time and time and again in the history of the church. Today, it's pretty much a dead question. It's not controversial anymore in any way, but it does come up. It has been problematic more recently in the history of the church than one might think. All right. So he saw the dishonor, Paschal II saw the dishonor, which such an act, this concession, must reflect upon his pontificate. I thought of St. Gregory's great work destroyed, of the church in bondage, of the backward movement, which must throw Christian Europe much more into the gloom of barbarism, gave no peace to his soul. So those are all dangers that he saw as potentially rising from the concession he had just granted. So he decided to, a great number, we'll just go through this. A great number of bishops and cardinals condemned the treaty by compulsion. So they pointed out, which was in fact the case, that it was granted under duress, most certainly. The councils of Italy and France condemned the investitures and renewed the excommunications launched against Henry V. The church was threatened with a new schism for the sake of his own peace of mind, as well as to reassure the alarmed Catholics. Paschal convoked a council in the Lateran Basilica, which opened in March of 1112. That's on the anniversary of that today. In fact, that's an interesting coincidence. The Pope appeared before the assembled prelates, acknowledged his weakness, put off his pontifical dress, and declared himself ready in atonement to abdicate the pontifical throne. So the fathers unanimously besought him to retain the pontifical dignity, and he yielded to their requests, to their prayers in that sense. So he says that compelled by the violence to which I was subjected, I have signed an unjust treaty for the good of my own soul and the honor of the church, and desires to repair the evil. And Pius VII would do much a similar thing later on. He actually didn't even say mass for 3 days after he granted a similar right to Napoleon, convinced he had lost his soul as a result of having granted that. So he went back on it after that. And he was approached by at least 2 cardinals who told him that was a bad idea. Again, that was Pius VII, generally speaking, who was willing to bend over backwards to try to appease Napoleon, which again never worked. Napoleon was just, the most you can say about him is he was the ultimate rat. When you study his whole life, his whole career, yeah, absolutely, there's no other way to describe him than that. All right, that's another very entirely different story for definitely another day, but it's a similar thing. But this is something that doesn't come up often in the history or in current controversies, even though today, keep in mind, today people are in fact looking. There are people out there who actually want to conclude that the church has defected. Not only is defectible, but has defected. They want that, and they positively almost start jumping for joy when they think they've discovered an example of it. It's actually quite disturbing to see. But keep in mind, it's a general principle that when people don't act in accordance with their beliefs, they end up believing in accordance with their actions. That's a general principle. You see that constantly. And that's exactly where recognize and resist leads people. What they are in fact professing by their actions, whatever they might say, whatever they might say that they acknowledge in the teachings of the church, what they are saying in practice is that they think the church has not only is defectible, but has defected. And so you can see that in more recent years, that their beliefs have started to shift to come into accordance with their actions. But there's definitely a disconnect. For as long as they keep holding, in theory, that the church is indefectible, but still proclaim every day, and by their daily actions, each and every single day, the opposite, there's going to be an obvious contradiction, an obvious disconnect. And nobody can live with that forever. Nobody can perceive a contradiction between his ideas and his actions and live with that forever. He's going to either convince himself there is no contradiction or shift one or the other so that things come into line. And when you can see that, in recent years, people have started to shift their beliefs, have started to actually, in ways that are in themselves heretical. I don't see how they objectively that it avoids the censure of heresy. Whether any one of them is subjectively, formally, in a formal sense, guilty of heresy is another thing. But I have to leave that to God to judge ultimately. But keep in mind, that is precisely where that leads, and you can see that. And some years ago, it was several years ago now, but there was one particular, it was a layman who didn't know what he was talking about, but he published this article in it that was positively triumphant in tone, in which he supposedly had found instance of the church teaching error. And he was happy, triumphant, celebrating. And that was obviously the tone of his piece, was that he was happy and celebrating. I thought he'd won. He had the taste of victory in his mouth for having found, so he thought, error coming from the church. Yeah, happy. That's where that leads people. Recognize and resist leads people to that. So you do see that. You do see people who call themselves traditional Catholics, or Catholics anyway, but who want to have found a defected and defectible church. Now, they think that that's they start jumping with joy almost when they think they found it. I think they found proof of that. It's disturbing in itself. Right, all the things to keep in mind. So then Paschal II, after having stated that he did what he did under duress, under unjust fear, of course, and pressure, he then protested that he received all the decrees of his predecessors relative to the investiture and to simony. I approve, he said, what they approved. I condemn what they condemned. I forbid whatever Gregory VII and Urban II forbade. And by the grace of God, I shall ever remain in these sentiments. Right. So after this protestation, Girard, Bishop of Angoulême, in the name of the Pope and of the whole Council, read the following declaration. So we won't read every word of it, but denouncing the treaty and the way in which it was procured by Henry V. The sentence, signed by all the bishops present, was sent to all the churches of the Catholic world. By way of making his atonement more complete, Paschal wrote in person to several bishops, giving them an account of what had happened. So, for example, to Guy, Archbishop of Vienna. We'll move past them. I need to read every single word of those things, but there you have it. So we do have here at the bottom of page 40, or the left-hand column on page 45, Baronius, who is an excellent church historian. He was a disciple, you could say, of St. Philip Neri, who wrote his history of the church in obedience to St. Philip Neri, who saw he clearly had talents in that, with regard to that, and required him under obedience to do it effectively. He didn't want to, but St. Philip Neri more or less made him do it. And good for us that he did, because Baronius is very good. In fact, he became a cardinal, ultimately. So the question itself is thus viewed by Baronius: the concession of the right of investiture with the condition of freedom and canonicity in the election as granted by Pope Paschal II does not constitute a heresy, but to maintain what Paschal II never said, that of canonical right, the investiture, should be one word, investiture should be bestowed by laymen, would be a formal heresy. It would indeed bring into the church an error contrary to the teaching of the Holy Fathers, to the constant tradition of all ages, and to the opinion even of contemporary writers who defend Paschal. So the imprisonment of the Pope and the outrageous conduct of Henry V had aroused the indignation of the whole Catholic world, as well it should. So protestations of the deepest filial love and devotion poured in upon the Holy See on the occasion. So we'll move past all this, so every word of it, but indeed, generally speaking, Catholic Europe rallied behind the Pope on this occasion, which is, of course, excellent to see. Even the Emperor Alexius Comnenus, and this is after the Greek schism, sent a deputation to Pope Paschal protesting his attachment to the Apostolic See and deploring the outrages offered to the sacred person of the pontiff by the King of Germany. Henry V was sorely chafed by all these pledges of veneration and love and lavished upon the common father of the faithful. No surprise there, really, that he would be upset at that. In 1117, he once more marched upon Italy at the head of a numerous army. On the way, he seized upon the succession of the great Countess Matilda, utterly regardless of the often repeated intention of the princess, who in life had made a gift of all her states to the Holy See. So, in other words, he stole the property, which was supposed to go to the Holy See. Paschal did not await the emperor's return at Rome, but withdrew to Beneventum. Henry entered the Eternal City in triumph and swore to the inhabitants that he came among them with the most friendly intentions, and not likely. On Easter Sunday, he would have renewed in some sort in the Church of St. Peter the ceremony of his coronation, but no prelate would consent to lend his ministry to a prince who invaded Rome with a hostile army, driving out its lawful pontiff. Henry was accompanied by Maurice Bourdin, Archbishop of Braga, who had been appointed apostolic legate to his court. So he turned traitor, though. Like another Judas, this faithless minister betrayed his master. He placed upon the brow of Henry V, the crown upon the brow of Henry V, while the Roman clergy and people loudly bewailed his base compliance. So very low subservience, servile submission to Henry V. Maurice was soon to disgrace his name by another sacrilege. We'll see what that is. When the Pope was informed of this scandal, he assembled a council at Beneventum and excommunicated the apostate prelate. This was the last act of Paschal's pontificate. He yielded to the weight of cares and labors on the 18th of January of 1118, leaving in history the record of a momentary weakness expiated by years of stern struggle and tireless energy. A pontificate so shaken by storms was not without its consolations. The Latin kingdom of Jerusalem gradually spread its power over the plains of Asia. So notice that after the First Crusade, which was famously won in 1099, the number of Crusader states were established during that First Crusade. And the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, easily the most famous one. The old cities of scriptural memory, which you see is listed there, successively came into the hands of the Crusaders, so further places of great significance in sacred scripture. Godfrey de Bouillon inspired even the unbelievers with admiration and love for the Christian name. So notice this. Some might be inclined to paint the Crusades as just a war to exterminate all Muslims or something like that, which was obviously not the case. As indicated right here, several emirs once came down from their mountains in Nablus and Samaria to offer him their homage and gifts. They found the king of Jerusalem seated upon the bare ground, unattended by courtiers or guards. So they were, in short, edified by his the way he conducted himself personally. But notice he received them and didn't try to kill them as soon as they came within sight. That was never the goal of the Crusades, to exterminate anybody. It was to fight a war that was necessary to fight in order to procure safe passage of pilgrims. And once that end was accomplished, they did not seek to keep the fighting up anymore. Only to deal with those who stood in the way. And even then, it wouldn't have happened had it not been difficult for them for pilgrims to make pilgrimages in the first place. That was the motive. All right, so Godfrey survived the capture of Jerusalem only 1 year, so he died in 1100 AD himself. He was buried in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre at the foot of Calvary. So the dust of the Christian hero thus fitly mingled with that of Joshua and Gideon, of David and Judas Maccabeus. So Baldwin, his brother, inherited both his realm and his valor. The memory of his reign is illustrated by the foundation of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, a very famous Crusader order, of which there were a few different ones. The pilgrims to the Holy City had long since established a hospital attended by hospitalers, who devoted themselves to the service of Jesus Christ in the person of his suffering members. So you see how they came to be known as. Sometimes they're not actually known by a few different terms, a few different names. So the Knights of St. John, or the Hospitallers, or the Knights of Malta, because they eventually took up residence on the island of Malta, where they very famously withstood a siege in the 16th century. That's several hundred years after this, or a few hundred years after this anyway. But that's how they've come to be known by all those different names. But given where they were founded, what different things that they did, and places they defended in the course of their existence. All right, so at the time of the conquest, the hospital proved a most acceptable resort for the wounded and infirm soldiers. The generosity of the noble crusaders and of the pious Godfrey increased its income in proportion to its wants. It was at length suggested to form the Hospitallers into a military religious order which could, at need, afford an armed defense to the pilgrims entrusted to their care. Such was the beginning of the world-renowned order whose noble ranks have so well served the whole of Christendom. So the new religious were put under the rule of St. Augustine. They made 4 vows, which you see listed there. Now, in addition to the usual 3, also devotion to the defense of the pilgrims against the unbelievers. So they wore the knights of the dress of the knights of that time, with a red Maltese cross upon a black mantle. So you see, that's what they were. Then they were noblemen, knights. Again, knights were, remember, that was a rank of society, as well as, of course, a military function. Knights are famous for their expensive suits of armor that they would wear, which were not nearly as heavy. It's not our focus here, but they were not nearly as heavy as some people tend to imagine that they were. People tend to think that just collapse to the ground while wearing one of them, and that's just not the case. Obviously, they rode horses while wearing these suits of armor. They could only have been so heavy. Now, horses are big and strong, but they do have their limits. And if something weighing an absolute ton were placed on a horse, they would not be able to carry it or not be able to walk too far. But horses were able to gallop into battle carrying knights encased in armor, so could only have been so heavy. So they wore the dress of knights at the time, so it was not only a military function. Of course, you think of a knight, you think of a military figure encased in armor riding into battle. Yes, definitely they did that, but it was also a function in society. That was a rank, a significant rank in civil society at the time. So they were noblemen. Knights were noblemen, not to be confused with their men-at-arms, who were more rank-and-file soldier. Knights were something like the officers. Now they did fighting on their own, but suits of armor were expensive. Horses also expensive. So they did have just regular rank-and-file men-at-arms, as they were called in the Middle Ages. So the order was confirmed by a bull of Paschal II in 1112 and was definitively organized in a general chapter held in 1118 under the second Grand Master, Raymond of Puy, who divided the members into 3 classes: knights, chaplains, and servitors. The canons, guardians of the Holy Sepulchre, were likewise armed by King Baldwin, afterward, not to be confused with the more famous Baldwin IV, the leper king. That came later. He was later on. Afterwards, became the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre. Toward the end of the 15th century, they joined the Order of St. John of Jerusalem. So you have these different rearrangements, reorganizations, mergings of these different religious, military religious orders. So the same circumstances of position gave rise at the same period to a third order of knighthood, long story short, known as the Templars. So, like the Hospitallers, they followed the rule of St. Augustine. Moreover, they made a vow to die in defense of the religion and honor of Jesus Christ, but without assuming any obligation to nurse the sick. So the Hospitallers had that, hence the name, but the Templars didn't take on that particular function. So the Templars, that's a name that, for whatever reason, the Freemasons decided to try to claim the Templars at a certain point. Obviously, at the time, this long predates Freemasonry, or the ideas of Freemasonry even. But the Templars, it seems they did go bad. They started out good. They started out just another military religious order on the grounds of the East of the Temple. Hence, that's how they came to be known as that. Knights of the Temple, which has since been made, so this order, and our author points out, has been made so variously celebrated by their military exploits and their tragic ends. So that's something for another section of church history. They eventually went bad and were suppressed by a pope. But they've also had, on the other hand, a history of service, of good service for the church, for the defense of the Holy Land. So they wore a white mantle with a red cross. The foundation dates from the year 1118, but it was not till 1129 at the Council of Troyes that St. Bernard gave them a special rule that was binding upon the members until the time of the suppression. So, our author now transitions to talking about St. Bernard of Clairvaux. And that is the Catholic pronunciation of the name, by the way, Bernard. Protestants say Bernard. Also, it's the name of the dog, St. Bernard dogs. That's the correct pronunciation of that. But the name of the saint, we'll see the last father of the church, is St. Bernard. So the regeneration of the monastic life, the government of the whole world, placed in some sort under this was placed. It should be under this way of holiness and genius in his hands. The wonders of the early ages of the church renewed, the crusades directed, whole provinces brought back to the faith, princes guided by simple religious, from the almost inaccessible shades of his desert cells, such as the spectacle placed before our eyes in the life of the sainted abbot of Clairvaux. So, St. Bernard of Clairvaux. About 8 years before the first conquest of Jerusalem, he was born of a noble family of Burgundy, near Dijon, which is famous for mustard. Piety was apparently truly an heirloom in the family, as its noble rank and title. And he was prevented, so that's a different sense of prevented, not prevented from something, but prevented, prevenio, Latin to come before. Something came before him. Of course, grace everybody to do anything supernaturally good, of course, needs grace, the help of grace. And so he was prevented. It came before him. That's to say, something came before him. What came before him? Grace. The fullness of grace, which was yet to work such mighty deeds, so fullness in the sense of to a great extent. This very example is a kind of home-dwelling apostolate. So there are such instances of that. For example, we mentioned St. Philip Neri a little while ago. He wanted to be a missionary. He wanted to go to India or someplace. But he actually spent his entire life in Rome. Now, if he traveled anywhere else, it wasn't where he was mainly anyplace else than Rome. So he wanted to go out into the far reaches of the missions. He ended up conducting his apostolate, such as it was, in the very capital of the church, as we can call Rome. That was big. That's all in his biography. It was the dispositions of divine providence that made it clear to him at a certain point that he was meant to work in Rome itself, rather than go out to that. He may have even said that at some point, that Rome is my mission territory, so something like that. Words to that effect. He reached some kind of conclusion very similar to that. And indeed, that's what he did. So, a kind of home-dwelling apostolate. Here he began to exercise on all around him that pious and holy fascination which afterward controlled the age in which he lived, which made him the master of kings, the counselor of popes, the guardian of empires, which gave him the surname of Doctor Mellifluus, and the glorious title of the last of the fathers of the church. So, notice we're in the 12th century here, and still in the time of the fathers of the church. So the fathers of the church are all the doctors of the church up to and including St. Bernard. So we see St. Bernard, doctor of the church, definitely. All of the doctors of the church coming before him, all also considered to be fathers of the church. Not to be confused with the ecclesiastical writers. It's a term that might sometimes be used very generally to include the fathers, but there are some characters who are definitely ecclesiastical writers and not fathers of the church, because they're not doctors of the church, or not even canonized at all. Maybe they didn't even die Catholics, as far as we can tell. So Tertullian, for example, somebody who has said some good things. Other ecclesiastical writers are people who said some good things, but have other problems that have related their feet. So Tertullian just became a heretic. He went completely crazy in that sense. Started all kinds of really stupid things. He was a hothead and went off the deep end, as they say. But he did say before that, he said some good things. So his writings are, you have to be careful with his writings. It's definitely not something you can quote from the pulpit, because people might get the idea then that that he's somebody who's safe to read and to follow in every respect. But he did say some good things. He some quotes of his, and they're good. I think even St. Alphonsus quotes him, for example. He definitely said some good things. It's undeniable. And also, being very early in the history of the church, even ecclesiastical writers who have problems can bear witness to certain things that are very useful information to us, that constitute very useful information to us. So Tertullian definitely went crazy. Origen is another one of those ecclesiastical writers who definitely said some good things, but the problem is, we covered that in the last year or two, but that there are certain things, some actually very serious errors, on very basic points in his writings. But it's unclear whether those actually came from him or not, because he complained himself about the fact that people were messing with his writings and were inserting things into them that he didn't say. So it's unclear whether he actually held those errors on. He could have, it's possible, but it's just uncertain. So that somebody, because of that, and just that would stop someone from being canonized. Even aside from all questions of personal reputation, of personal sanctity or not. Just a problem in somebody's doctrine, even just any shadow of a doubt is enough to prevent that person from being canonized. It's not to say that no saint ever made any mistake in sacred theology, but the number, when you look at the numbers of errors and how serious they are there in his writings, you realize, okay, no wonder he's only listed as one of the ecclesiastical writers. But okay, just to make all of that clear. So St. Bernard was sent out with 12 religious to plant the cross of Christ in a savage waste, so in some place that was relatively untamed, which soon changed its forbidding name to that of the illustrious valley, so Clara Vallis, so clear in the sense of luminous, or clairvaux. So you see, that's the kind of thing that French does to Latin. Takes some of the syllables and runs them all together. So you get things like clairvaux from Clara Vallis. And that's relatively mild. Look at some names of French cities and you look at what they are in Latin. That's what it was originally in Latin. And sometimes it gets butchered beyond recognition. The French would say perfected and improved, no doubt. But according to the common estimation of prudent men, butchered out beyond recognition. So, anyway, for half a century, he drew the admiring gaze of all of Europe upon this treasure of loftiest genius joined to the purest virtue. Well, so move on to the pontificate of Gelasius II, which did last very long, notice, but still certain interesting things we need to take note of. So the hatred of the German emperor for Paschal II, should be okay, not supposed to be a period there, it's supposed to continue, had made him provident. So in other words, he started looking to the future and started taking precautions for all the wrong reasons to further his own evil agenda. Henry had left secret instructions with his partisans in Rome, directing them, in the case of an approaching vacancy in the Roman See, to oppose the election of a new pope until his consent should be received. So at the death of Paschal, the cardinals thwarted the tyrant's plans. So that's something that was done away with. Or, well, they tried to, maybe to check that actually, but I'm not saying they're still observing it at this time. But in any case, at the death of Paschal, the cardinals thwarted the tyrant's plans. They met and 7 days afterward elected John of Gaeta, cardinal deacon and chancellor of the Roman Church, a noble old man who met the violence of a stormy pontificate with a truly apostolic firmness. So if he's a cardinal deacon, that is a position certain of the cardinalatial churches have the title of cardinal deacon, even if it's a bishop that holds it. But in this case, we'll see he actually is a deacon. So he took the name of Gelasius II. On learning of the election, Teuccio Frangipani, leader of the German faction, broke into the church with an armed band, seized the Pope by the throat, hurled him to the ground, and tore his body with his spurs. Then, loading the pontiff with chains, he threw him, wounded and bleeding, into a dungeon. The cardinals and senators, unable to escape, with no gentler treatment, several were slain upon the spot. So, hardly need to point out how horrible that is. At the report of this deed of violence, the prefect of Rome, leading his troops, and then followed by an immense multitude in arms, marched to the capital, and demanded that the Pope should be given back to them. So, the terrified revolters at once surrendered their august prisoner. On their knees they implore and obtain forgiveness, and Gelasius II, born in triumph by a people crazed with joy, solemnly took possession of his see. So the day was appointed for his ordination. We said he was only a deacon. So he's still to be ordained a priest and consecrated a bishop. Even though obviously he's an old man, and we don't know don't have here at least his exact age, but he's considered to be an old man who was never ordained a priest. And there's sometimes you're surprised to find out some people in the history of the church who were ordained deacons but not priests. St. Francis of Assisi, for example, was a deacon but was never ordained a priest. And it was humility that prevented him from going that far. So, sometimes you see that. You can't force anybody to be ordained. So, deacon, he was only a deacon at this point, so he had to be ordained. Again, that is necessary for someone to validly receive the pontificate, for the election to be valid, is that he has to consent to episcopal consecration, at least to receive jurisdiction. He has to truly accept, to be considered to have truly accepted the election, he has to consent to episcopal consecration. And there are those who go so far as to say that the universal peaceful acceptance of the church of a man as pope is a guarantee that he's baptized, that his ordination and episcopal consecration all valid. Yeah, whether or not that's the case is another thing, but there are authors who do say that. That's the strength that some give to universal peaceful acceptance. So, he definitely does still have to be ordained, that's for sure. It's Pius XII who taught that, by the way. That it has to accept episcopal consecration. To truly accept the election, I believe is exactly what he said. But one of those things. Okay, so he hurries on by forced, as Henry V interferes in this, and hurries on by forced marches from the extremity of Germany. One night, the Pope was suddenly informed that the Emperor, with his troops, held the Church of St. Peter. So he sent this message to Gelasius that if you are prepared to confirm the treaty which Henry V, made with Paschal II, sign, I am ready to submit to your authority. So if you sign this, so it's probably supposed to be a comma or something after Paschal II. Sign, probably semicolon. Sign, and I am ready to submit to your authority. If not, I shall have another pope elected, and shall place him in the possession of the Holy See. In other words, I can't do that, of course. So what he just threatened to do is start another schism. He's threatening to dig up another anti-pope and start another schism. So the sovereign pontiff hurriedly quit Rome and embarked upon the Tiber. So this happens sometimes. Popes sometimes have to flee for their personal safety. A violent storm drove the vessel upon the coast of Porto. The German troops crowded the bank and shot their arrows into the pontifical galley. Or galley is a type of ship. Gelasius escaped under the cover of darkness and landed at Gaeta, his native city, where he was received with a respectful and pious eagerness. Henry had, in the meantime, procured at Rome the election of an anti-pope, Maurice Bourdon. You may recognize that name as the one who was involved in crowning him emperor at a certain point. So the false legate excommunicated by Paschal II in the Council of Beneventum. He assumed the Roman purple with the title of Gregory VIII. So the true pope was consecrated, however, at Gaeta, so consecrated a bishop at Gaeta, which still had to be done, in the presence of William, Duke of Apulia, and Robert, Prince of Capua, and the host of Italian lords, who swore fidelity to his cause and authority. So there are still some who are loyal to him, of course. He convoked a council in Capua, where he solemnly excommunicated the anti-pope and the Emperor Henry V, at the same time directing the Archbishop of Toledo and the bishops of Spain to provide another incumbent for the see of Braga, instead of Maurice, whose intrusion had cut him off from the bosom of the Catholic Church. So also, yes, to install an anti-pope and then to follow him, that is to be part of a schismatic sect. Definitely. So that's why there are those who today think they can go and elect a pope. When they do that, they're actually starting their own little schismatic sects. So, them, and the people who have those ideas. Now, it would not be a good thing for them to do it. Of course, it'd be very bad in itself that they tried to elect a pope, which they can't do, and start a schismatic sect. But it would have the accidental benefit, again, purely accidental, but the accidental benefit of making it clear that people who have those ideas are not to be taken seriously. They would completely shoot themselves in the foot, as they say, if they were to do that. It'd be easy, because nowadays, I mean, these are groups of people that already have problems anyway. But nowadays, if you pointed out, they'd like to whine and complain of not being nice to other Catholics and things like that. Never mind that they actually have problems that maybe need to be pointed out for the good of souls. No, they just whine and complain that they're not being treated nicely. But that would be easy to point out. No, they just formed a schismatic sect. It had nothing to do with them. That's easy. That's something that most people can understand easily. All right. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, men sub tuum presidium confugimus, sancta Dei genitrix nostras supplicationes et despicias in necessitatibus, sera periculis cunctis libera nos semper vigo gloriosa benedicta. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti.